Ethan Collins sat in the middle of Silvergate University's grand conference room, under the watchful eyes of the Academic Review Board. His essay, a carefully crafted analysis of the MAGA movement's economic policies, had ignited a firestorm no one could have anticipated. Across the polished oak table sat his professor, Dr. Laura Whitman, a tenured academic known for her unwavering progressive beliefs. Her sharp glare seemed to pierce through Ethan, as if he were the embodiment of everything she opposed. "Mr. Collins," began Dr. Elena Brooks, the head of the board, her voice steady but firm, "you have alleged that your professor failed you due to personal bias rather than the academic merit of your work. Your claim has sparked a campus-wide controversy that challenges the principles of academic freedom at Silvergate. This board has conducted a thorough investigation. The evidence we've uncovered raises serious concerns." A murmur rippled through the room. Students and faculty alike had packed the gallery, waiting anxiously for the next revelation. For weeks, the story of Ethan Collins, a top political science student who dared to challenge the ideological status quo, had gripped the campus. Ethan straightened in his chair, his heart pounding. He remembered the hours he had poured into the essay, researching the Make America Great Again movement's economic initiatives. While he disagreed with some aspects of the ideology, he believed it was worth analyzing. His essay critiqued the movement's controversial trade policies while highlighting the resurgence of manufacturing jobs in key regions. It was an academic exploration of cause and effect, not a political manifesto. Or so he thought. When he received his paper back, a glaring red F dominated the first page. Below it, scrawled in sharp handwriting, were the words, "This is not academic work. It's propaganda, and I won't tolerate it in my class." Those words had stunned him, not because they challenged his arguments, he welcomed debate, but because they dismissed his perspective entirely. He had approached Professor Whitman in her office, hoping for clarity. Instead, she had doubled down. "Your essay promotes ideas that fuel division and hate, Mr. Collins," she had said, her tone cold. "I refused to legitimize that in my classroom." Now, weeks later, the stakes had escalated. The Academic Review Board had uncovered evidence suggesting that Ethan wasn't the first student to face such treatment. A pattern was emerging. Conservative viewpoints were consistently penalized in Dr. Whitman's courses. Ethan's essay was just the tip of the iceberg, Dr. Brooks continued, her tone grave. "Professor Whitman, the board has reviewed not only Mr. Collins' essay, but also your grading history over the past 3 years. There appears to be a disproportionate pattern of failing or low grades assigned to students with views that differ from your own. How do you respond?" Professor Whitman's knuckles turned white as she gripped the papers in her hands. "My responsibility," she said sharply, her voice echoing in the silent room, "is to maintain an environment of truth and progress. Essays like Mr. Collins, defending harmful ideologies like MAGA, undermine that mission. I stand by my grading decision." The room erupted in whispers. Ethan felt his anger rise, but he kept his composure. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about maintaining truth, Professor. It's about silencing ideas you don't agree with. I followed every guideline you set for this assignment. I backed my arguments with data from respected economists and think tanks. The only thing I failed at was aligning with your personal beliefs." Gasps filled the room. Even Dr. Brooks seemed momentarily taken aback by Ethan's conviction. The tension was palpable. And then came the bombshell. Dr. Brooks held up a folder, her expression unreadable. "As part of our investigation, we've reviewed multiple essays and grades from your students, Professor Whitman. There is evidence that your bias has impacted not just Mr. Collins, but others as well. This hearing is no longer just about a single essay. It's about whether your conduct has violated the university's principles of fairness and academic integrity." Ethan's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected this. He had thought he was fighting a personal battle, but now it was clear this was bigger than him. Right when you thought the situation couldn't escalate further, another layer of truth emerged. Professor Whitman's actions had divided the campus, with students and faculty taking sides. What started as one student's fight for fairness had become a battleground for free speech and ideological freedom. Before we dive deeper into this explosive story, I want to hear from you. Do you think Ethan deserves justice in this situation? If you're loving this story so far, comment 2 below. If you feel differently, drop a 7. We value all perspectives here. And hey, if you're into thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more tales that challenge the status quo, spark debates, and keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Let's keep the conversation going. Your thoughts matter. Before the storm erupted, Ethan Collins was just another diligent student navigating the politically charged environment of Silvergate University. Known for its vibrant academic culture, the university prided itself on being a hub of progressive thought and rigorous debate. But beneath that veneer of intellectual openness, there was an unspoken rule. Some ideas were simply not welcome. Ethan wasn't one to shy away from tough topics. As a junior majoring in political science, he believed that every perspective, no matter how controversial, deserved to be explored in an academic setting. So, when Professor Laura Whitman assigned the class an essay on the impact of modern political movements on American policy, Ethan saw an opportunity to challenge the narrative. His essay, titled "The Economic Ripple Effect of the MAGA Movement," was anything but a blind endorsement. He acknowledged the divisiveness of the movement, but focused on its measurable economic outcomes, such as the revitalization of certain manufacturing sectors and shifts in trade policy. Drawing from credible sources, Ethan analyzed both the successes and failures, presenting a balanced, data-driven argument. To him, this was the essence of academic inquiry, asking hard questions and letting the facts speak. But Ethan also knew his choice of topic wouldn't sit well with Professor Whitman. Her lectures often strayed from neutrality, veering into impassioned critiques of conservative ideologies. She championed progressive causes with fervor, making it clear that she viewed movements like MAGA as regressive and harmful. Still, Ethan believed that his adherence to academic rigor would protect him from bias. When he submitted his essay, he felt a flicker of pride. He had spent weeks researching, carefully structuring his arguments to meet the guidelines laid out in the syllabus. What he didn't expect was the devastating response he would receive. The paper came back with a bold red F scrawled across the first page. Below it, Professor Whitman had written, "This essay perpetuates dangerous rhetoric disguised as analysis. It fails to meet the ethical standards of this course." Ethan's stomach dropped. He flipped through the pages, scanning her notes. Words like propaganda, irresponsible, and biased jumped out at him. Not once did she challenge his data or methodology, only the viewpoint itself. Determined to understand, Ethan scheduled a meeting with her. As he entered her office, a cramped space lined with books on social justice and political theory, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. But he was ready to defend his work. "I'm here to discuss my essay," he began, his tone respectful but firm. "I followed every guideline you provided, cited credible sources, and presented a balanced argument. I don't understand why my grade reflects anything other than the quality of my work." Professor Whitman leaned back in her chair, her expression unwavering. "Ethan," she said, her voice clipped, "this isn't just about following guidelines. Your essay advocates for policies that have caused harm to marginalized communities. As an educator, I have a responsibility to challenge that." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, keeping his composure. "I didn't advocate for anything. I analyzed economic data and its effects on various sectors." "Isn't that what you asked for?" She shook her head. "What you call analysis, I call normalization of harmful ideologies. I won't tolerate it in my classroom." The meeting ended with no resolution, leaving Ethan frustrated and disillusioned. He had always believed that universities were places where ideas, no matter how contentious, could be debated openly. But now, he wasn't so sure. It felt like the very principles of academic freedom were being twisted to silence dissent. What Ethan didn't know then was that this wasn't just his fight. His case would soon become the catalyst for a larger reckoning at Silvergate University. one that would pit students, faculty, and administrators against each other in a battle over fairness, bias, and the true meaning of education. Right before the break, have you ever felt like your perspective was dismissed because it didn't fit the norm? Share your experience in the comments below, and stick around because things are about to get even more heated. As whispers of Ethan's confrontation with Professor Whitman spread across campus, the story took on a life of its own. Some students rallied behind Ethan, applauding his courage to challenge what they saw as an entrenched bias in academia. Others sided with Professor Whitman, viewing her actions as a necessary stand against ideas they deemed harmful. The air at Silvergate University grew tense, with every hallway conversation laced with heated opinions. Ethan wasn't looking to become a campus symbol, but the fallout was inevitable. One evening, he returned to his dorm to find a flyer slipped under his door. It read, "Stand for academic freedom. Rally tomorrow." Ethan was startled. He hadn't organized anything, but it was clear his story had struck a nerve. The next day, the quad was packed. Students held signs with phrases like "fair grades, not political games," and "end classroom bias." Ethan tried to stay on the sidelines, but when someone handed him a microphone, he found himself stepping onto the makeshift stage. "I didn't write that essay to provoke anyone," Ethan began, his voice echoing across the crowd. "I wrote it because I believe in exploring ideas, even ones that make us uncomfortable. Isn't that what learning is supposed to be about?" The crowd roared in agreement. But as Ethan spoke, he noticed a smaller group gathering at the opposite end of the quad. Led by students who supported Professor Whitman, they held signs of their own: "No space for hate," and "Protect the truth." One student from the opposing group grabbed a bullhorn. "Ethan Collins isn't fighting for academic freedom," she shouted. "He's fighting to legitimize harmful ideologies that threaten our community." The two groups clashed in a cacophony of chants, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger and frustration. Campus security moved in to keep the peace, but the divide had been drawn. Ethan's battle with Professor Whitman had become a campus-wide conflict. As the protests continued to swell, the administration could no longer ignore the situation. Dean Marcus Collins, Ethan's father, was called into an emergency meeting with the university president. The dean had tried to remain impartial, but the evidence mounting against Professor Whitman was too significant to overlook. "We're not just dealing with one grade dispute," the president said, her tone grave. "This is turning into a crisis. We need to launch a formal investigation, and we need to do it now." Dean Collins nodded, though his face betrayed his inner turmoil. He knew that his involvement as both a father and a university leader would draw scrutiny. But he also knew this wasn't just about Ethan. It was about ensuring that all students were treated fairly. The university announced the investigation the following morning. In a statement, they emphasized their commitment to academic integrity, promising to review Ethan's essay, Professor Whitman's grading history, and any related complaints. The announcement sent shockwaves through campus, intensifying the divide. Professor Whitman, feeling the heat, went on the offensive. In an interview with the campus newspaper, she doubled down on her stance. "My job is to guide students toward responsible, ethical thinking," she declared. "If we normalize harmful rhetoric like MAGA, we're failing as educators. This isn't about bias, it's about protecting truth." But behind closed doors, Professor Whitman was facing mounting pressure. As part of the investigation, the Academic Review Board uncovered emails between her and other faculty members. In one particularly damning exchange, she wrote, "I don't care how well written these essays are. I refuse to validate perspectives that contradict progress." The emails leaked, and the campus erupted again. Ethan's supporters saw it as proof of her prejudice, while her defenders argued that her actions were justified in the name of combating harmful ideologies. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForthan and #StandWithWhitman, turning the campus controversy into a national debate. Right when you thought the stakes couldn't get any higher, the investigation uncovered something even more explosive. Professor Whitman's grading history revealed a consistent pattern of penalizing students with conservative viewpoints. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was a systemic issue that called the university's values into question. As the evidence mounted, the question loomed: would Silvergate University hold Professor Whitman accountable, or would they succumb to the pressure of protecting one of their own? Stay tuned, because the next revelation will shake everything to its core. The air in the conference hall was thick with tension. The final hearing of the Academic Review Board had drawn an unusually large audience. Faculty, students, and even members of the media had gathered, eager to witness the climax of the controversy that had engulfed Silvergate University. At the head of the room, Dr. Elena Brooks, the chair of the review board, tapped her gavel, calling the session to order. This hearing marks the conclusion of our investigation into allegations of bias in the academic practices of Professor Laura Whitman, she announced. We will now hear statements from both parties before presenting our findings. Ethan Collins sat on one side of the room, his jaw tight but his eyes steady. Across from him, Professor Whitman looked composed, though the tension in her clenched hands betrayed her calm exterior. Between them was a table piled high with evidence, email transcripts, past essays, grading rubrics, and testimony from other students. Dr. Brooks turned to Professor Whitman first. Professor, you've been given the opportunity to review the evidence presented against you. Do you have any further remarks? Whitman stood, her voice measured but defiant. I stand by my decisions as an educator, she began. It is my responsibility to guide students away from harmful ideologies that threaten our community and undermine societal progress. The MAGA movement, which Mr. Collins chose to defend in his essay, is not a subject of academic exploration. It is a tool of division. Her words sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Ethan's hands tightened into fists, but he stayed silent, waiting for his turn. Dr. Brooks nodded and turned to Ethan. Mr. Collins, you may respond. Ethan rose, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Professor Whitman claims my essay was propaganda, but what I wrote wasn't an endorsement of MAGA, it was an analysis of its economic policies, supported by data and credible sources. I followed every guideline she set for the assignment. What I didn't follow was her personal ideology. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with students and faculty alike. This isn't just about me. It's about whether academic freedom means anything at all at Silvergate University. Are we here to challenge ideas or to silence them? Because if it's the latter, then we've failed as an institution. A wave of applause broke out among some students, quickly silenced by a stern glare from Dr. Brooks. She gestured for order and turned back to the evidence. As part of this investigation, she said, the board reviewed emails and past grading patterns from Professor Whitman. What we found was troubling. Numerous essays, similar in quality to Mr. Collins, were penalized for their perspectives rather than their adherence to academic standards. We even uncovered warnings from previous semesters advising Professor Whitman to avoid allowing personal biases to interfere with her evaluations. The room went silent, but the final blow came unexpectedly. A student stood from the audience, raising her hand hesitantly. Dr. Brooks gestured for her to approach. My name is Sophia Ramirez, the student said, her voice trembling but resolute. Last semester, I wrote an essay on immigration reform from a conservative perspective. I backed it up with research, just like Ethan did. Professor Whitman failed me too, and when I asked why, she said my ideas were damaging. I didn't report it back then because I thought no one would listen. But now, seeing Ethan stand up, I knew I had to speak. The impact of Sophia's testimony was like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the room, and Ethan felt a wave of both vindication and anger. He wasn't alone. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Dr. Brooks turned to Professor Whitman, her expression grim. Professor, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Whitman's composure finally cracked. This is a witch hunt, she snapped, slamming her hand on the table. I did what any responsible educator would do: challenge ideas that harm society. If that makes me biased, then so be it. Her words hung in the air, defiant but hollow. The weight of the evidence against her was undeniable. Dr. Brooks rose, her tone final. The Academic Review Board has concluded that Professor Whitman's grading practices violated the principles of fairness and academic integrity. Effective immediately, she will be suspended pending further disciplinary action. Additionally, we will implement new policies to ensure that all students' work is evaluated impartially, regardless of political or ideological perspectives. The decision sent a shockwave through the room. Some students cheered, others booed. Professor Whitman stormed out, her face a mix of fury and disbelief. Ethan sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like a victory, just a necessary correction to a broken system. As the room began to empty, Sophia approached Ethan, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for standing up," she said. "I wish I had done it sooner." Ethan nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Sometimes it takes more than one voice to make a difference. For Ethan, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a broader conversation about bias, fairness, and the role of education in fostering real dialogue. Silvergate University had taken a step in the right direction, but the battle for true academic freedom was far from over. The days following the hearing felt surreal for Ethan Collins. Overnight, he had gone from being an anonymous student to the unlikely face of a campus-wide reckoning. Everywhere he went, whispers followed him, some admiring, others resentful. For every student who congratulated him on standing up for fairness, there was another who muttered under their breath about conservative propaganda. But the fallout wasn't confined to the student body. The faculty was in turmoil. Some professors privately applauded the review board's decision, admitting they had long been uneasy with Professor Whitman's overt partisanship. Others, however, viewed her suspension as a dangerous precedent, an attack on their ability to challenge harmful ideas in their classrooms. Ethan tried to keep his head down, focusing on his studies. But one evening, as he left the library, he found himself cornered by a small group of students from Professor Whitman's supporters. "You think you've won something, huh?" One of them sneered, their voice dripping with contempt. "All you've done is give power to people who want to destroy progress." Ethan stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about fairness. If I were penalized for my arguments, what's stopping someone like you from being penalized for yours?" The student faltered, momentarily speechless. Ethan seized the moment. "The point isn't to agree with me, it's to make sure everyone gets a fair shot to be heard. Isn't that what progress is really about?" The group dispersed, leaving Ethan alone but resolute. He knew the journey to real change wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to see it through. Meanwhile, Professor Whitman's suspension continued to send ripples through the academic world. National media picked up the story, turning it into a battleground for the culture wars. Conservative outlets hailed Ethan as a champion of free speech, while progressive voices framed Whitman as a martyr for intellectual integrity. The university found itself at the center of a fierce public debate, one it was ill-prepared to handle. Dean Marcus Collins, Ethan's father, bore the brunt of the criticism. Accusations of favoritism swirled, with some claiming he had orchestrated the investigation to protect his son. Marcus knew the optics weren't ideal, but he stood firm. "This was never about Ethan," he told the university board during a tense meeting. "This was about maintaining the credibility of our institution. If we can't separate personal bias from academic judgment, then what are we even teaching our students?" But the most surprising twist came weeks later, when an unexpected email arrived in Ethan's inbox. The subject line read, "A confession." It was from Professor Whitman. Ethan hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The message was long but deeply personal. "Ethan, I never thought I would write this, but after weeks of reflection, I realize I owe you an apology. Not just for the grade, but for letting my emotions and beliefs cloud my judgment as an educator. When I read your essay, I didn't see the thoughtful analysis you presented. I only saw an ideology I deeply opposed. That was wrong. My role was to evaluate your arguments, not your beliefs, and I failed you in that responsibility. I hope you can forgive me. Sincerely, Laura Whitman. Ethan stared at the email for a long moment, unsure how to feel. This was the same professor who had dismissed him so thoroughly, who had fought tooth and nail to justify her actions, and now she was admitting fault. After some thought, Ethan decided to meet her. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe off campus. When he arrived, he found Professor Whitman already seated, her posture tense but her expression sincere. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said as he sat down. "I wanted to say this in person. I was wrong, Ethan, about your essay, about how I treated you, about everything." Ethan nodded slowly. "I appreciate the apology. But what made you change your mind?" Whitman sighed, her gaze distant. "When I saw how the students divided, how this campus turned into a battlefield, I realized I'd contributed to that. And then I reread your essay. You weren't defending everything about MAGA, you were analyzing its economic effects. I should have seen that." The conversation that followed was surprisingly candid. For the first time, Ethan saw Whitman not as the antagonist in his story, but as a flawed human being grappling with her own convictions. And in turn, she saw Ethan as more than just a student challenging her authority. He was someone trying to navigate a complex world, just like her. As they parted ways, Whitman offered one last remark. "You taught me something, Ethan. It's not enough to be right. You have to be fair, too. I hope I can be better moving forward." Ethan walked away from the meeting feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The fight had been worth it, not just for himself, but for the lesson it had imparted to everyone involved. In the months that followed, Silvergate University implemented sweeping changes. A new system for anonymous grading was introduced to ensure impartiality. Professors underwent training on implicit bias. And while the campus was still healing from the fractures of the controversy, there was a renewed commitment to fostering real dialogue. For Ethan, the experience left a lasting mark. He graduated with honors, but more importantly, with a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. His fight had sparked a change, not just in the university, but in himself. The question now was, how far could this ripple effect go? Months after the dust had settled, the changes at Silvergate University were becoming evident. The once tense atmosphere on campus had given way to a cautious optimism. Debate forums sprung up, encouraging students to discuss contentious topics in an open and structured way. Faculty members embraced the university's new policies, with many reflecting on their own practices. Ethan Collins, now in his final year, became something of an unofficial mentor for students who felt marginalized or silenced. His inbox filled with messages from peers seeking advice on how to handle bias or stand up for their ideas. To Ethan, this was proof that the battle he had fought wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. One email stood out among the rest. It was from a freshman named Mia Turner, who shared her own story of being dismissed in class for questioning the effectiveness of a widely accepted policy on climate change. "I don't know if I should bring it up," she wrote. "I don't want to be labeled or targeted like you were." Ethan replied quickly, offering to meet her in person. At their meeting, he shared his story, the fears, the backlash, and the ultimate triumph of standing firm. "Your perspective matters," he told her. "Not because it's right or wrong, but because it challenges the norm. That's how we grow." Meanwhile, Silvergate's administration was working to repair its reputation. Dean Marcus Collins spearheaded initiatives to ensure fairness in every aspect of the academic process. The anonymous grading system became a model for other universities, and Silvergate began hosting annual conferences on academic freedom, drawing educators from across the country. One of the keynote speakers at the inaugural conference was none other than Professor Laura Whitman. Her decision to step back into the spotlight was met with skepticism, but her speech surprised everyone. "I stand here today not as someone who got everything right, but as someone who learned from getting it wrong," she began. "The events at Silvergate forced me to confront my own biases. I've realized that as educators, our greatest responsibility is to create space for every voice, even the ones we find uncomfortable. That's where real education begins." Her words were met with applause, not unanimous, but genuine. For the first time, Whitman felt she was contributing to something larger than her own convictions. Ethan sat in the audience, watching the ripple effects of his actions unfold. He hadn't expected to see Whitman take accountability so publicly, but her transformation was proof that even the most entrenched minds could change. As the conference wrapped up, the university president approached Ethan. "You've started something here," she said. "Have you thought about what's next?" Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "I've thought about law school," he admitted. "I want to fight for fairness on a bigger scale." "Well," she replied, "if your time at Silvergate is any indication, I'd say you're already off to a strong start." Years later, Ethan Collins stood on the steps of a federal courthouse, now a young lawyer specializing in civil rights and education reform. A reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Collins," she asked, "you've been called the voice of academic freedom. Looking back, how do you feel about what happened at Silvergate?" Ethan paused, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a single essay and spiraled into a movement. "I feel grateful," he said finally, "not just for the outcome, but for the challenges. They taught me that fairness isn't something you wait for, it's something you fight for, and it's a fight worth having every time." As he walked into the courthouse, the ripple effect of his actions at Silvergate continued to spread, reminding everyone that even the smallest stand for justice could lead to profound change. Ethan Collins stood at the edge of Silvergate University's campus, gazing up at the historic clock tower as it chimed softly in the distance. It had been years since the events that had changed not just his life, but the very culture of the university. The once divisive campus now stood as a beacon for dialogue and fairness, a testament to what could happen when people dared to challenge the status quo. As the memories flooded back, Ethan felt a mixture of pride and humility. He thought about the long nights of doubt, the fear of being misunderstood, and the courage it took to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent. But most of all, he thought about the people, his classmates, his father, even Professor Whitman, who had all played a role in shaping the journey. Each of them, in their own way, had taught him the power of resilience, empathy, and dialogue. He walked toward the library, passing a bulletin board filled with flyers advertising debate forums, academic workshops, and mentorship programs, all initiatives born from the changes he had helped ignite. A small flyer caught his eye, Voices of Change, a student-led symposium. It was a reminder that the fight for fairness and open dialogue didn't end with him, it was continuing, stronger than ever. As he reached the campus gates, he heard a familiar voice call out behind him. Turning, he saw Sophia Ramirez, now a teaching assistant in the political science department. She smiled warmly and handed him a small plaque. "We wanted you to have this," she said. "It's from the university, a way of saying thank you." Ethan read the inscription, "Ethan Collins, for championing academic freedom and inspiring the next generation." He felt a lump rise in his throat but managed to smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But this wasn't just me, it was all of us." Sophia nodded. "Maybe, but you showed us it was possible." As Ethan left campus for the last time, the words of his father echoed in his mind. Fairness isn't about the easy victories. It's about standing up when it matters most, even when the odds are against you. He had learned that lesson firsthand and knew it would guide him wherever life took him next. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the campus. Ethan paused one last time, looking back at the place where it all began. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. The impact of his journey would ripple far beyond the walls of Silvergate University, because fairness, freedom, and the courage to listen weren't just academic ideals, they were the foundation of progress. And Ethan Collins had proven that even one voice, when brave enough to speak, could spark a change that echoed through generations. What an incredible journey Ethan Collins went through, right? Now, it's your turn. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Did Ethan stand for fairness make a difference? Or do you think there's more work to be done in situations like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this story, or if it made you think, give it a thumbs up to let us know. Don't forget to comment and share your perspective. We value every voice here, just like Ethan did. If you're new to Elderly Wisdom, welcome to the community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that challenges the norm, inspires change, and keeps you captivated. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. We couldn't do it without you.